Hi everyone and welcome. This video is different to my normal ones. Although Wallsend history is and always will be my main focus, I am also very interested in the history of all of the North East, Northumberland, people, places, etc. So some of my videos will be about other things and not just Wallsend. This video is about Mark Sherwood. Mark was the last man to be hanged publicly on the Town Moor in 1844, having been found guilty of murdering his wife. I hope you will find it interesting. Please do let me know if you liked it. This is his story. Mark was born on April the 19th, 1789. His mother, Dinah Sherwood, was said to have been just over 16 years of age at the time he was born. Some say that his father was a coachman who worked on his grandfather's farm, and others say he was a respectable farmer, but neither of which have been confirmed. On the day that Mark was born, he was taken from his mother and given to a lady known only as Nancy. Nancy was married to his grandmother's nephew, who was a tailor in a nearby town. His mother later married and had at least 6 more children. It seems that he never lived with his mother. He stayed with Nancy and her husband, who are believed to have been called Robert, for around 6 years. Then his uncle came for him and took him to live with his grandfather. It was his grandfather who also sent him to school. He was left £100 when his grandfather died, and his mother sent him £10 a year from his grandfather's estate until her death in 1829. At the age of 18, he joined the Royal Regiment of Artillery, and he remained in this service until he was 30 years old. On leaving, he was granted a pension of around 5 pence per day. In 1828, he married a lady whose name is possibly Anne Bainton. She seems to have suffered greatly with ill health. She is said to have suffered a stroke which had left her blind or with very poor sight and unable to use her left-hand side. Mark did care for her, but some people who knew them at the time said that he could also be cruel and unkind to her. During his 1844 trial, it was suggested that he had killed his first wife as well. However, a letter was soon printed in the papers by a witness who was also a neighbour, who had known them both and was present when his wife had had her accident. They clearly stated that Mark was not at home at the time, and that they believed she had set fire to the scarf or headscarf that she had had on her head, and assuming that she was unable to see, this would have been quite plausible. The letter went on to say that the neighbour had heard her screams and gone to her aid. She was quite badly burnt and died some short time later, although the death was not thought to have been caused by the burns. In 1832, Mark married Anne King in Hereford. She had previously been married and was often referred to by her maiden name of Humble. Also in October 1832, Mark was arrested, having been accused of assaulting a woman known only by the name of Ruth. It is said that he was drunk at the time. However, he was acquitted and released on October the 22nd. His description at the time is that he was 5'7½", with brown hair, grey eyes and a fresh complexion. It seems that he also had several tattoos, as a sun, moon, stars, heart and mermaid are all mentioned in his description. Although there's no exact date, it is sometime after this that Anne and Mark moved to Newcastle. Anne had been born in Wooler in around 1792, so perhaps they had moved to be a little closer to some of her family. They lived in Blandford Street at the time. The marriage was not said to be a happy one. They were both described as being short-tempered and often violent towards each other. They had a private still in their home which was used for making whisky. Anne seems to have been in charge of this. Mark's only contribution seems to have been drinking it. However, it was perhaps not that good, as he would still spend all of his pension money on alcohol. On March the 13th, 1844, a loud argument was heard at their home, and Anne was said to be using some very abusive language. Her niece called at the house, and I must add here that some say this was her cousin, and her name is either Anne Grant or Anne Sutherland, as reports in the papers differ very much on this part. Anyway, she called at the house during the argument, and it seems that her presence managed to calm things down. She persuaded Anne to allow Mark to stop in their home. Prior to this, he had been asking Anne for money to allow him to leave and not return. The niece-cousin left and was always said to remain quiet. The same lady called back to their home the following morning. She was unable to get an answer at the door. There is one report which says she met Mark outside and he told her that Anne had gone visiting someone, no name mentioned, and that the cousin niece went to look for her and returned after not being able to find her. However, most reports say that she knocked several times and Mark was heard to shout that Anne had gone out and locked him inside, and it was at this point she then went looking for Anne. On her return, she knocked again. By now she was very worried, as she had not been able to find Anne where she had been told she would be. She was able to get a key from a neighbour and let herself into the home. It was then that she found Anne lying in a pool of blood and Mark laying beside her. They both appeared to be dead. However, Mark was just very, very drunk, having drank most of the contents of the still, and had to have his stomach pumped before he was able to talk. The police, including Inspector Little and the doctor, were then called. Anne was described to have had defensive wounds to her hands and that her throat had been cut. 2 razors were found in the fire grate, and it was said that these were the ones used in the attack. Mark Sherwood was carried to the police station, where he was arrested and charged with willful murder. Some reports suggest that Anne was actually planning to leave her husband, but that the argument from the previous night had resumed and that Mark had lost his temper and attacked her. Other reports say that the argument was still over the illicit still and that Mark was not happy with it being in the home, as he felt that it may cause him to lose his pension. Whatever the argument was about, it resulted in Mark attacking Anne with the razor and then drinking himself senseless. The post-mortem was carried out by Dr. White, and he concluded that the cut to the throat had killed Mrs. Sherwood. She was 52 years old. There are not many details of the trial, other than the aforementioned reference to his first wife, which had angered Mark so much that he had struck the table violently and asked, "Who has brought this tale to Newcastle?" Although his defence was very good, the jury still found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. The public did have some sympathy for him, and attempts were made to try and save him from the gallows, but these were not successful. The date was set for August the 23rd, 1844. From the end of the trial to the date of the execution, the Reverend Lewis Page visited Mark in prison on a regular basis. It is not known if he had any other visitors in prison. He did confess to his crime to the Reverend Page, but he denied that it had been premeditated, claiming that the argument over the illicit still had resumed and that he had lost control and killed his wife on impulse. The execution day arrived, and prisoners would be transported through the streets from the prison to the Town Moor, often on a cart, and the streets would be lined with people wishing to see the prisoner one last time. The prisoner would be pinioned. This means that their hands would be tied at the wrists and sometimes also their legs at the ankles. At 23 minutes to 1 on August the 23rd, the procession arrived at the Town Moor. It seems that executions took place in the centre of the race course, and on this occasion it was estimated that some 25,000 people were there to see it take place. It is not known if the crowd at the time would have been aware that this would be the last public hanging or not. Mark appeared to be calm and respectful and bowed to the watching crowd. He asked for his eyes not to be covered, and this request was granted. It was usual at the time that prisoners would have their heads covered and their eyes covered with a hood. He stepped onto the drop, where he shook hands with the chaplain, the sheriff and the prison governor. The drop fell at 9 minutes to 1. Death was instant. Mark was 55 years old. As was the custom, his body was not removed from the gallows for 1 hour, and afterwards the body was taken for burial within the prison walls. Mark had asked for his grave to be very deep so as not to be disturbed. I believe this stemmed from the time of the body snatchers, and many people were still worried that they would be taken by body snatchers to be used for medical science, and he also asked for a prayer to be read at his burial. He was buried later that day, and his grave was said to be 7 foot deep, but no prayer was read. Also, those buried within the prison walls would not have been facing east, as was the usual Christian burial position, as this was another part of their punishment. Some years later, in 1925, when the prison was demolished, several bodies were found and reinterred in secret in an unmarked grave in All Saints Cemetery. A recent plaque has been displayed in this cemetery. However, of the 15 buried within the prison walls, only 11 were found, and some recent research that I have done suggests that one of those missing was actually Mark Sherwood, so perhaps his burial worries were not unfounded. I hope you have enjoyed this somewhat sad and tragic story. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching, and please do give this video a like, and also please subscribe to the channel if you would like to hear more stories similar to this one in future. Thank you.